Hello everybody and welcome to another video. So I have made a video before on my channel about asexuality, but I made that video when I was about 18 and I just felt like it was time to update it. I wasn't like 100% satisfied with it anymore. So I'm doing it over today, and this is just going to be a everything I can get into this video, all of the basics that I could think of to talk about. I'm gonna cover a little bit of what is asexuality, how did I come to know that I was asexual, which by the way, I identify as asexual. I did in 2016 when I was 18, and I have not yet grown out of it. I'm also gonna cover just some stuff that I think everyone should know about asexuality. I have my notes here, by the way, so I'm just looking at them. I'm going to talk about some of the more difficult stuff that asexuals have to put up with, as well as I'm also going to talk about some of the important intersections that I think need to be talked about around asexuality and the LGBTQ+ community. Let's get started. Cheers! I have a glass of red wine here. I'm channeling my cat Black in this video. So let's begin with what is asexuality. Asexuality itself is when a person does not experience sexual attraction to anyone of any gender. Allosexual is the opposite of that. People who do experience sexual attraction and who form the majority of people when it comes to sexual attraction. Now, asexuality is a spectrum. There are many other identities on the spectrum, which I will talk about a little bit later on. And how did I come to identify as asexual, and when, and so on? So I would say that I started to seriously question if I was asexual when I was about 17 or 18. And it was just sort of a process of looking around me and realizing that everyone else seemed to be thinking differently about sex than I was. Other people started thinking about sex much earlier than I was. And sex wasn't really something that I thought about or was curious about at all until I was well into high school. And, you know, people started talking about sex and I was kind of like, wait, what? So I started identifying privately as asexual when I was about 17 and a half or 18, and that was just me being like, okay, let's just say that I'm asexual. Try on the label, put it on like a dress in the changing room and see how it feels. And the more that the longer and the more I thought about it, the more correct it felt, and the more everything started to make sense. And yeah, it's been sort of 5 years now, and yeah, it still makes sense. I'm a little bit nervous about making this video. I'm nervous that I leave things out. I'm nervous that I put things in that I shouldn't. I'm just gonna be here, drinking my wine, doing my thing. We can talk about it in the comments. Okay, so here's some stuff that I think that everybody should know about asexuality. Hello, it is me, Sunday Misk, and I'm editing. And I found a cool document. It is a census out of 2015 of about 9,000 people, and the vast majority, over 8,000 of those people, are asexual identifying people or ace spectrum identifying people. And I would like to make a full video about this survey, just kind of unpacking as much of the data as I can. But I figured that for now I would just include a couple of statistics in this video that kind of back things up when I require them to be. So the first thing is that asexuality is not the same thing as being aromantic. Some people are both asexual and aromantic. Some people are asexual but not aromantic. Some people are aromantic but not asexual. So aromantic refers to not experiencing romantic attraction, and asexual refers to not experiencing sexual attraction.
So in this 2015 asexuality census survey thing, of the asexual group, 24.7% of those who identify as asexual also identified as aromantic, which means that about 75% of asexuals did not identify as aromantic as well. And on the other hand, 13.1% of non-asexuals said that they identified as aromantic.
And that kind of leads into my second point, which is that there are many different kinds of attraction. And I'm sure that everyone is aware of that, because I'm sure that everyone knows that you can experience platonic attraction for one person and romantic attraction for another person. But I'm not sure that everybody has thought about the extent that that can go. And the kinds of attraction that I would name would be sort of platonic attraction, which is, you know, how well you get on with another person as friends. Romantic attraction, which is the desire to be in a romantic relationship with someone. Physical attraction, which is, you know, just pure like looking at somebody and going, you look attractive. Sexual attraction, which is specifically to do with sex. But then there's sensual attraction, which has to do with physical touch outside of sex. So non-sexual, sensual touch could be things like kissing, hugging, cuddling, holding hands, any kind of like touch or physical intimacy outside of sex, which would, in my definition, be sort of any kind of contact involving the genitals would be my my kind of ballpark there. I suppose there could be more like intellectual attraction or emotional attraction. There's also another one which is kind of a new one to my vocabulary, and it is alterous attraction, which refers to something that is not quite platonic but not quite romantic either. But the point is that asexuality is to do with sexual attraction only, which means that asexual people might still feel romantic attraction for people, might still feel sensual attraction for people, and they might experience those kinds of attraction in various combinations, and that's true for anyone. But for asexuals, the difference is to do with sexual attraction. Next, there is something called the split attraction model, which is kind of a topic of hot debate among asexuals and in the LGBTQ+ community. But the generally more accepted conclusion is that asexuals can identify as asexual and still identify with other LGBTQ+ labels. Like someone could be asexual but identify as panromantic, or asexual but identify as a lesbian. And I'm not going to get too much more into the controversies there, but yeah, split attraction model if you'd like to know more about it.
Hello, me again. So an example of what I'm talking about to do with the split attraction model is in the 2015 survey. When asked which of the following sexual orientation labels do you most closely identify with, while 58% of the asexuals in the survey responded that they only identify as asexual, graysexual, demisexual, some of the asexual group still chose to identify with labels like bisexual, gay, lesbian, pansexual, and queer. Also, it's notable that the number that identify with these other labels was higher in the ace spectrum categories that were not strictly asexual. For example, 3.3% of asexuals identified also as bisexual, but 11.9% of demisexuals also identified as bisexual. When it comes to identifying with a specific romantic orientation label, many ace people, in addition to identifying as asexual, also identified with a romantic label like heteroromantic or panromantic, biromantic, homoromantic, or something else, as opposed to choosing not to identify with any kind of other attraction label other than asexual.
Now we're coming back to the asexual spectrum, and I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the identities that you can find on the asexual spectrum. And the idea of this is mostly just to make the point that there are a couple of many different variations of asexual that kind of use the concept of asexuality as the sort of guiding star for how they feel. But I can't possibly mention them all in this video. There are so many. But here are a couple of the main ones that you can kind of see some of the differences between some of them. So, of course, firstly we have asexual, and that pretty much means zero sexual attraction to anyone of any gender. Then we've got gray sexual or gray asexual, which means that somebody might experience sexual attraction under particular conditions or for particular people. Then we've got ace flux, which is where somebody always identifies as somewhere on the asexual spectrum, but it kind of shifts around. Maybe sometimes they feel more demi, maybe sometimes they feel more ace, maybe sometimes they feel kind of all the way on the other end where the allosexual side is, and it kind of fluctuates. Then we've got demisexual. Demisexuals do not experience sexual attraction unless they've already formed an emotional bond with someone. So a demisexual would probably never meet someone and think, I'm sexually attracted to you, we should have sex. But over time, through bonding with that person, the sexual attraction might sort of develop. Then we've got lithsexual or acoisexual, which is where somebody might experience sexual attraction for someone until that sexual attraction is reciprocated, at which point they're like, maybe not. Maybe enjoying having a sexual crush on someone, but not wishing for it to be reciprocated and for it to go anywhere. Then there's agosexual. Somebody who's agosexual might enjoy sexual fantasy, pornography, erotica, that sort of stuff. Enjoys like the mental side, the psychological side, thinking about sex, but doesn't really wish to engage in it in reality. And then there's quasexual, coisexual, or WTF sexual, which is when a person doesn't really understand what sexual attraction is, can't really figure out if they feel it or not, isn't really able to identify what sexual attraction is, and so just doesn't really ever know if they're feeling it or not. I'll link to some things in the description if you'd like to read more about different identities on the asexual spectrum. Next, I'm going to talk about the fact that asexuality is not the same thing as celibacy or as abstinence. So celibacy and abstinence are a choice that you make to not engage in sex. Generally, sexual attraction is something that you do experience, but you decide not to have sex for one reason or another, especially for religious reasons, or for whatever reasons. A person is deciding that they would not like to have sex. And I'm sure that plenty of asexuals are celibate and do abstain from sex, but asexuality and celibacy are not necessarily the same thing. Which leads me into my next point, that some asexuals do still have sex. So asexuality doesn't mean necessarily that a person does not have sex. So there are sex repulsed asexuals, sex neutral asexuals, and sex favorable asexuals. So sex repulsed asexuals, it's pretty much what it sounds like, are repulsed by the idea of sex. They don't want really anything to do with sex, alone or with a partner, and I'm sure there's plenty of like variation within that as well, but generally the feeling of like ick towards sex. Sex neutral asexuals, they're neutral about sex. Take it or leave it. And sex favorable asexuals feel positively about sex, may wish to engage in sex, may enjoy engaging in sex, may engage in sex on a, you know, semi-regular or regular basis, but do not experience sexual attraction. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a little while. A note here is that sex repulsed, sex neutral, and sex favorable is different than sex positive, sex neutral, and sex negative. And that has to do with ideologies around sex. So someone who's sex positive doesn't take any kind of ideological issue with sex. Thinks, you know, sex is good for other people, you know, generally open about talking about sex, conversations about sex, is not anti-sex. Whereas sex negative people are people who have some kind of ideological issue with sex in certain contexts, you know, are not so pro the idea of like talking about and normalizing sex in society. Another thing to note under this, you know, concept that asexuals may still have sex is that asexuality, sexual attraction, is not the same thing as libido or sex drive. Some asexuals, though they do not experience sexual attraction, may still have a sex drive or a libido, so the desire to engage in sex. And the desire to engage in sex is not the same thing as experiencing sexual attraction to a particular person, right? There's a running joke in like asexual circles that like it's always funny when asexuals are talking about sexual attraction because none of us know what it is. None of us know what it feels like. So we're all just like, it's kind of like, it's like when you want pizza, but the food is a person's genitals. Like, do you know what it is, Jimmy? No, man, I don't know. Sorry, we've had an SD card change of angle. Keep you on your toes. Look at my baby butt. I hope I've explained enough on that point. I will put a video down below by Hannah Witton, made a video in which she explains sex drive really well and in a really interesting way. Not necessarily, she wasn't talking in relation to asexuality, but I think that that notion of what is a sex drive is helpful to this conversation, so I'll link that below. And on that note, when it comes to libido and sex drive, it's important to know that asexual bodies are exactly the same as allosexual bodies. So if a person was interested in engaging in sex, it was something that they wanted to do, and they're not sex repulsed, and they're, you know, interested in having a consensual experience, an asexual body will feel sexual pleasure in exactly the same way. And I think that's a big part of why so many asexuals engage in sex, is because mechanically, physically, it's exactly as pleasant as it would be for an allosexual, because the physical portion is the same. The sexual attraction is what is missing, but enjoying the act of sex doesn't require that. Another big reason why asexuals may decide to engage in sex is if they were in a relationship with somebody who was allosexual, or with any partner where they wanted to experience sex as a part of their relationship. And that's a perfectly valid choice to make as well, as long as it's consensual. If your partner is ace, please make sure that everything that is happening is consensual. I cannot stress that enough. Another thing on the topic of asexuals still have sex is that plenty of asexuals actually also engage in BDSM and kink. It is not a purely allosexual thing to be involved in. And as well, many asexuals also self-pleasure as well. And that also kind of corroborates the idea that asexuals' bodies work just the same way.
Statistic time. So in this 2015 survey, when it came to kink, BDSM, and fetish, while 46% of ace spectrum people scored themselves at a 0 in terms of interest in kink, BDSM, and fetish, compared to 19.6% of non-asexuals. This was a scale from 0 to 4. So even though these numbers for asexuals are slightly lower than for non-asexuals, still about half of all asexuals in this study had at least some degree of interest in kink, BDSM, or fetish. Obviously, because BDSM is not a strictly sexual activity and there's way more to it than just sex. I'm sure many of these asexual people practice BDSM, some of them including sex and some of them excluding sex. When it comes to self-pleasure, 18% of all ace spectrum people said that they have never self-pleasured, although keep in mind that the people answering this survey range from age 13. So compared to 5.3% of non-ace people. The highest portion of all ace spec people said that they self-pleasure a few times a month, where the highest portion of non-ace people answered that they self-pleasure a few times a week.